talk is entitled Navigating Two Languages.
Thank you very much. I have to say that the writer cannot separate himself from what he is. So I'm supposed to be here speaking as an author, as a poet, as a short story writer and essayist. But the fact is that I can't separate those people from the teacher, or from the person, or from the daughter or the mother or wife. So what I'm going to do is range quite a bit and speak about a great many aspects of what goes into the making of a poem or a story. In other words, I am going to give you something about my identity. And we're right back to where we were this morning with a discussion of identity and what it means. I was very interested when the last speaker said something about how people tease her saying that she is not Dominican, that she is claiming an identity that is not really hers because she was not born on the island, and other people claim that she's not really a North American because she has a different background. And what I would like to say to her and to everyone else and to all the young people growing up in this country as second or third or fourth generation Dominicans, nobody has a right to assign your identity to you. Only you can do that. Nobody can tell you you are not this enough or not that enough or whatever it is. And all over the world there are people who are only too eager to tell people in their midst what they are and what they are not. But nobody can do that unless you give them permission to. And I want to beg you not to give anybody permission to do that. But to be your own identity, what your circumstances of your life make you, what your passions, what your convictions make you, in other words, what you are. And that's important to remember. I had the good fortune when I came here in 1939, and I say good fortune not because there was nothing painful or difficult about it, there was. But I say good fortune because there were also a great many positive circumstances. I came as the daughter of political exiles. My father used to work for his uncle, for my great uncle, who was ministro in Washington D.C. He was we came here on diplomatic visas, diplomatic passports, and then the massacre of the Haitians took place in 1937. And I was about 5 at that time when I was with them for the first time in the United States. And my great uncle had the great daring, and some people would say the great craziness, to write a letter to the dictator, to Trujillo, in which he told him exactly what he thought of that event, of that horrendous event, and how he could no longer work for a government. And that was what he, as my uncle said, un gobierno criminal, a criminal government. That was not well received, and my great uncle and my father and the whole family and everyone who was with him was called enemigos de la patria, and they were exiled. My mother took me back to the DR, which was absolute madness on her part, but she wanted to see her family again. And she thought that she could duck in and duck out again without being noticed, and she left me with my grandmother, came back and joined my father, and then they went from Washington, D.C. to New York and began life there. I came 2 years later, in 1939, to New York City for the first time to that city. And why was I fortunate? Well, because I never found myself in a situation where I was the only other person. I was never the only outsider anywhere. I was surrounded by outsiders from everywhere. I found myself in every classroom as the first Dominican. There were no Dominicans around at that time. And everybody around me was something else. There were Greeks, there were Italians, there were Chinese and Japanese. There were people from every corner, and a great many of them in 1939 had fled from Europe for very important reasons. They had to save their lives. And a great many of them left families behind that they never saw again, just like mine. My father pointed out to me that we were not the only people who had lost entire families. And I learned that lesson very well and never forgot it. That was the first of the great life-changing discoveries that I made in New York City. It was the fact that everybody is uprooted those of us who knew ourselves to be uprooted had nothing to feel different about. That pretty much the whole human race at that point in history was running from one place to the other. So that I never felt discriminated against. I never felt separate from anybody around me. And that was a very reassuring discovery, because what it told me was that we were all in the same boat. And that if we were all going to arrive at port in the same boat, we all had to row together. The second important discovery I made is that all poetry does not have to be written in Spanish. That was very major. I had heard poetry in my grandmother's house as a little girl, and I had fallen in love with it very early. And before I could write, I knew already that that was what I wanted to do. But when I left, there were no more tertulias like the ones in my grandmother's house. People did not get together here to recite and play the guitar and tell stories and so on and so on. I thought, well, that's the end of that. But then, thanks to one of the really great inventions of mankind, the New York City public school system, I learned that there was poetry in English. And that was life-altering, because I said, well, if these people can write poetry too, then they're not all that different. And it was amazing. It was amazing, and immediately I was home. And what I discovered through the poetry, as I said yesterday, is that everybody really has much more in common than there are differences. The public school system, I call one of the great things about this country. Maybe its chief institution, maybe the institution that makes it America. Because what it says is, we are taking you, well, what the Statue of Liberty says, we are taking you from wherever you came from. We're going to throw you into this mess together. We're going to give you all the good stuff we can throw at you. We're going to give you teachers who will help you digest it and make something out of it, and make something out of yourself, and the rest is up to you. They didn't coddle us, they didn't hold our hands, they didn't do anything too special, because it would have been impossible. In order for them to do bilingual for me, they would have had to do bilingual for the Chinese and the Japanese too. So my teachers had names like Berkowitz and Hennessy, and well, every name in the book really, except Spanish ones. There weren't any yet. We had not yet reached that level as immigrants. We had not yet made our way into the teaching profession. But we knew we were getting there. And I felt that whatever I did with my life was, of course, up to me primarily, but I was getting an awful lot of help. The other great impact on my life was my parents, because they did not let me forget my language ever, ever. I was not allowed to speak English in the house. I had to speak Spanish in the house, because I had to be genuinely bilingual. And I was not permitted to throw words from one into the other. I'm saying all this now because it leads into language and writing. When I began writing, it became very clear to me that it had to be done in whatever language it came in. I couldn't force my thoughts into one or the other. And for the most part, of course, I wrote in the language in which I lived my daily life, which was English. But every once in a while, this miraculous thing would come in Spanish. And I always felt that was a gift from heaven. And I did manage to keep them separate, to write in both streams, and to translate occasionally from one to the other. There are very disturbing things happening today. I bring it up because it has to do with the question of identity, of racial profiling, of feelings toward the foreigner. When I was in New York City in the early 40s, in 39 and 40 and 41 and so on, there were no outsiders, because New York is an entirely outside city. The outsider is the insider. But right now, there are things happening, for example, in Arizona, that are dividing very sharply the outsider from the insider. And I have a wonderful brother-in-law, my husband's brother, who lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he keeps me posted on what happens out west with Hispanic events. So he sent me something that I want to share with you, because it's been more or less bothering me ever since I received it. This is an exchange that's been taking place in in New Mexico among several teachers. One teacher there who wrote the following.